Musk's Starship, the tallest and most powerful rocket ever built, is finally ready to conquer orbit. How has SpaceX prepared the Starship for this inaugural orbit flight, and what does it mean for Musk? In this video, we dive into all the juicy details of SpaceX finally going to orbit. Elon Musk is among the rare individuals that inhabit the intersection of desiring to go to Mars and having access to the resources to push the dream through. Backed by the massive fortune he has acquired as the world's wealthiest industrialist, Musk remains dogged in his ambition to make Mars a habitable place for the human race. However, going to Mars and moving 1 million people there in a short period requires much more than desire and resources. It needs lots of brains and foresight. Fortunately, Musk is well endowed in these aspects as well. The first step is to arrange the mode of transport. To move 1 million people over millions of miles in deep space, lots of factors have to come into play. The biggest one is the cost. Half a century of mostly theoretical analysis has made it abundantly clear that a permanent and sustainable extraterrestrial human outpost is impossible without a radical reduction in the cost of access to space. For decades, even NASA has studied different plans, but the cost to send a few astronauts to Mars for a few months at a time has been prohibitive. It would cost the government hundreds of billions of dollars. This is where Musk has to play it smart. The first step is to reduce the cost of transport significantly, because even for the richest man alive, there are limits. This is why SpaceX is building the Starship, which, despite being the most powerful rocket ever, will reduce the cost of accessing deep space. The trick is to make it reusable, not in part as SpaceX has been doing this before with its Falcon rockets, but entirely in both stages. This is easier said than done though, because reusability introduces a lot of complexities due to the capacity it is intended to have. Which brings us to another factor that Musk needs to work on to make his ambitions a reality. The Starship must be very powerful. Apart from moving humans, the Starship will need to move tons of other materials ahead of the colonizers. SpaceX has released details of how the colonization will take place, and much of it revolves around the Starship. Here is how things will work out initially for SpaceX to construct sustainable cities on Mars. SpaceX will soon commence launching uncrewed Starships to Mars to both verify the system's maturity and readiness and deliver significant quantities of cargo to the surface in advance of human arrival. By using a wide range of robotics, those early missions will help SpaceX characterize local resources, stage supplies, test technologies for long-duration Martian surface ops, and begin developing infrastructure, with a propellant plant likely the most pressing need. This, however, is just baby steps. The early uncrewed missions will deliver equipment for increased power production, water extraction, LOX methane production, pre-prepared landing pads, radiation shielding, dust control equipment, exterior shelters for humans and equipment, and more. All these are the hardware needed to support the first human base. Without them, there is no human base on Mars. Next is the actual arrival of humans on the planet. SpaceX says for the first few years they will live on the Starships that brought them until additional habitats are available. This will then free up the Starships for other uses as needed to support the humans. The Starships will be valuable assets on the planet, as they will be used for storage, habitation, scientific laboratories, and sources of refined metal structures and resources. The crazy part of SpaceX's plan is that the Mars-bound Starships could take off even before NASA uses the rocket to land its astronauts on the Moon. Also, while the space agency will pay $2.9 billion to SpaceX to use the Starship, Musk says all the funding for the Starship has been internal and does not even plan to source funds externally, at least not yet. For the Starship to be capable of all this, particularly the part where it moves tons of cargo to prepare the harsh habitat of Mars for human habitation, it has to be powerful and resilient. And that is what the Starship is. Powered by more than 30 Raptor engines, the Starship can lift more than 100 tons at a time to the Earth's orbit. The lower stage, or the Super Heavy, will return after separating, and Musk wants it to be ready for the next flight in about 30 minutes. The upper stage, or the ship, which will actually take people to Mars, relies on 6 Raptor engines to power it through space and land on Mars. It has a payload volume of 1,100 meters cubed, which SpaceX can configure for transporting humans or cargo. And that is where the first Mars settlers will live initially. However, before loading up the Starship and sending it off to Mars, SpaceX has to thoroughly test it and obtain approval from the authorities. Musk wants this to happen as quickly as possible, which is why SpaceX workers are working day and night in Boca Chica. The last significant test of the Starship took place on May 5th, when the SN-15 prototype was powered through ascent by 3 Raptor engines at about 10 kilometers altitude before reorienting itself and executing a controlled landing. Since then, SpaceX has moved on to the S-20 prototype and Booster 4 prototype for the Super Heavy. After a series of stacking and unstacking, SpaceX returned the 2 prototypes to the high base for more work. Bear in mind, though, that the Starship has yet to undergo its first orbital test. In preparation for this, SpaceX has equipped the S-20 for re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere by sticking heat-resistant tiles on one side of the prototype. The purpose is to protect the internal components from the massive heat that will be produced during the re-entry process. SpaceX has also fired all the 6 Raptor engines on the S-20 for the first time, as confirmed by Musk himself. It was successful, though brief, as it lasted only 3 seconds. However, in that 3 seconds, the SN-20 would have produced 1,110 tons of thrust if all engines were operated at full thrust. This would beat out the Russian Proton M booster. The Booster 4 prototype is even more powerful with its collection of 29 Raptor engines. Work is also progressing on the launch tower, showing how imminent the first orbital flight of the Starship is. SpaceX has rigged the launch tower's rocket-catching arms to a system of pulleys and drawworks. These are the arms that will grab, lift, and install the Super Heavy boosters and place the ships on top of them in the future. The tower's Starship Quick Disconnect arm has also been practically completed. It is the component that will fuel the Starship and stabilize the Super Heavy at the top. All the plumbing necessary for it to supply fuel has been completed. SpaceX has also completed multiple testing of the orbital launch mount that will support the Super Heavy and hold it down during testing and supply it with thousands of tons of propellants. The launch mount is quite complicated, as it contains 20 small umbilical and quick disconnect mechanisms that supply fuel to the Raptor engines on the outer rings of the Super Heavy. For a successful takeoff, all the 20 quick disconnect mechanisms must release simultaneously. Interestingly, the Starship is already winning commercial contracts. While SpaceX is wiping the floor in the space launch industry with its Falcon rockets, clients are already lining up behind the Starship, as it will offer significantly cheaper launches. In fact, there is a sort of cannibalization taking place, as the Starship is stealing clients from the workhorse Falcon series. Without approvals, however, SpaceX cannot proceed on the Starship's first orbital launch. One of the approvals is from the Federal Communications Commission, which has granted the company a temporary permit during the flight. The link is necessary for SpaceX to receive telemetry data from SN-20 during the orbital and booster stages of the flight. Telemetry is data transmitted by a spacecraft to Earth during flight, including information such as position and heading, systems operation, and so forth. SpaceX's goal is to collect as much data as possible during the flight to quantify entry dynamics and better understand what the vehicle experiences in a flight regime that is extremely difficult to accurately predict or replicate computationally. The data collected will guide SpaceX through any changes it has to make in the Starship design and improve its computer simulation. The other approval is from the Federal Aviation Administration, which is wrapping up an environmental assessment of the company's proposed operations at Boca Chica, the deadline of December 31st. If the FAA gives the green light, SpaceX will be able to apply for an experimental launch license after that date. Let's hear what you think of the Starship's readiness for its first orbital flight in the comments section below.